this is the beginning of a campaign for us to stop the process that's been going on for the last 30 years of ordinary working class people like us being ignored and taken for granted, and the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, and working class people and our kids are seeing our futures gradually becoming less and less optimistic. We think there's a chance to change the world, to change society, but to do that we do have to make our voices heard. We're not going to be able to do it just on the internet, by tweeting or by filling in petitions, although that can help in one way or another. What it's all about is getting our voices heard and getting a programme for change heard and taken seriously. Because once we start getting taken seriously, that's when the powers that be, the rich, the powerful, and their politicians that represent them, start to worry about things and they have to start taking us seriously. And without having any kind of working class representation, people like us, we just have to go begging and pleading, filling out petitions, writing letters and emails. It's not enough. We need people like us up there as MPs and councillors. And that's the whole point behind the Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition. It's a way of bringing people together. So, I'm not going to speak anymore. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Chris Williamson, who until recently was himself a Labour MP who supported the fighting socialist policies of the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn at that time. And we're really pleased that he's agreed to come and speak at the launch meeting today. So I'll hand over to Chris, and before Chris begins, I will just point out on the platform as well, we've also got Siobhan as well, who is from the Socialist Party, a socialist campaigner who's been fighting against cuts and austerity, to speak as well. And just finally, Dave Nellist, who will be outlining our campaign and what we stand for as Tusk. Once our top table have finished speaking, we'll make sure that we get a chance for everybody to speak as well, who's come to the meeting, to have your say and ask questions. And if there's questions that need to be answered, we'll put some time aside at the end to make sure that everybody hopefully will get an answer in one form or another. Final point, the toilets at the back and the bars over there, and the doors over there, I think the legal stuff out of the way. So over to you, Chris.
Well, thanks very much indeed for that introduction, and it's great to be here in Erdington, working to make sure that we can elect a Socialist MP for this constituency on the 3rd of March. And with a fair wind, I think we've got a great chance of achieving that. I've been out on the knob for, I think, 3 or 4 times already. And there is a great deal of dissatisfaction, it's got to be said, with all the mainstream parties. And people are really inspired, actually, by what Dave represents, what the Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition represents in this election. And it's really important, I think, that we do everything in our power to take that message out in the community here, because I do believe we are on the cusp of something really special here. I do think there's a real potential to start to shake up the cosy status quo down in Westminster. I mean, I spent 44 years in the Labour Party, flogging a dead horse, it turns out. And, you know, I suppose I was labouring under the misapprehension that one day we might be able to create a mass party and get a left-wing leader in place, and we could start to set about a social transformation of the country. And I thought all my Christmases had come together when Jeremy Corbyn was elected as a leader of the Labour Party. And then we were putting on, well, getting onto the ballot paper, of course, was the first thing, but then we started to put on, members, tens of thousands of new members were joining the party. Then when he got elected, tens of thousands of more members joined the Labour Party, like nearly 600,000 full members of the Labour Party. And when you take affiliated and registered supporters into account, it was well over 800,000. And yet we still didn't control the Labour Party, in spite of the fact that we had a mass movement, we had a left-wing leader. Still the party was in the hands of the establishment. And that, I'm afraid to say, is why I've certainly left the Labour Party now. The Labour Party has certainly lost its way. There is no real difference between the Tories and the Labour Party. It's a kind of red Tory or a blue Tory. You sort of take your pick. There is a neoliberal status quo. Whoever wins the election, the capitalist class, the corporate elites just continue, and as if nothing's changed. And, we're seeing that now, aren't we, with the election of Keir Starmer. But, you look back, really, the last time we had a Labour government, what did they do? It was a Labour government that introduced tuition fees. It wasn't the Tories, it was the Labour Party that did that. It was a Labour Party, a Labour government, that introduced private healthcare into the National Health Service, started the privatisation process of the National Health Service. The National Health Service that was founded by the Labour Party was started to be dismantled by a Labour government. What a disgrace. What an absolute disgrace that is. And of course we're also seeing, and Birmingham has been a particular victim of this, that we saw under, certainly under the Tories, under Thatcher, but continued under New Labour and Tony Blair, the offshoring of good quality manufacturing skilled jobs. The tens of thousands of jobs that have gone. Sometimes you'll hear people say, it's new technology, this is why there are not so many people, not so many jobs in manufacturing. And yes, of course, that has accounted for some of the job reductions that we've seen. But the vast bulk of it is as a direct result of corporations moving their operations to low-wage economies offshore. And where we do see technology coming, and where we do see automation, surely that should be used not just to increase profits, but to improve working conditions, to reduce the working week. We are the 5th biggest economy in the world. Why are we still having to work all hours God send in the 5th biggest economy in the world when we see all this new technology coming on stream? Why aren't we in a situation where we're actually seeing the fruits of that new technology, the fruits of that big economy, being shared more equitably? But it isn't being shared, is it? In this 5th biggest economy in the world, we've got 14 million people living in poverty. 1.5 million people are destitute. People sleeping and dying, indeed, on the streets, rough sleepers. You didn't used to see that when I was a lad, despite my youthful appearance, comrades. I remember in the 1960s and 70s, you literally didn't see people sleeping on the street and begging on the street. Now it's commonplace in every town and city in the land. And as I say, Jeremy Corbyn offered us hope that there would be a change, but of course it never happened. I've got 5 minutes gone. I've told I've got 15 minutes, so I've got 10 minutes to go, comrades. I'll try and keep it at that time. So thank you for that. So Keir Starmer talking about the party being under new management. Well, you're not kidding. You're not kidding. What is that new management all about, though? We've got an energy crisis, haven't we? Energy bills are going to go up by around 54%. What's Labour's response? Well, we'll reduce VAT by 5%. It's ridiculous. But we're going to rule out the prospect of any public ownership. No. That's not on the cards in a future Labour government. That's why I say there's no real difference. Just tinkering at the edges. That's all a Labour winning this constituency. It would be a reaffirmation, frankly, of a broken system. What else are they offering? We have a cost of living crisis, don't we? And we saw the Tories break their solemn pledge that pensions would increase in line with wage rises or in line with the rate of inflation. And of course they've broken that pledge now, haven't they? But what did the Labour Party do? What did the Labour MPs do in the House when this was voted on recently? Well, they just sat on their hands. And so what we're going to see now, in the teeth of this cost of living crisis, what we're going to see is a situation where the poorest people in the country, social security benefits and pensioners, are going to see a real terms reduction. So while fuel bills are going through the roof, pensioners and unemployed people and disabled people who have to rely on social security are going to see their living standards reduced still further. It's an absolute disgrace. And of course the other thing is, they are incredibly pro-war, aren't they? They're gagging for war. Jeremy Corbyn was wrong to criticise NATO. They're desperately keen, because it seems to me they're in the pockets of the military-industrial complex, aren't they? Who's doing really well out of this crisis in Ukraine at the moment? You just look at the share prices of some of these arms companies, these weapons manufacturers. Lockheed Martin, for example, their share prices are soaring. They will benefit from a war because they're going to sell more missiles, more weapons, more guns, more bullets to kill and maim people. And the notion of peace is somehow seen as being disloyal, as being against this country. It's an absolute scandal, and we have to call it out. And so that's why I think it's so important that we use this election to get somebody like Dave with his fantastic track record, unparalleled track record in my opinion, to actually go down there and to shake up that status quo. But of course Dave is also an incredible community champion as well. And there's plenty to be going at, isn't there, in terms of the local issue. So the Labour Party's broken in terms of the Westminster situation, but it's pretty much broken, isn't it, at a local level as well. What is the local authority doing about the housing crisis that's befallen the people of Birmingham? I mean, rough sleepers all over the place in Birmingham. People finding it almost impossible to get a council house, on the waiting list for years. This is a political choice. It's all very well them saying, there are cuts from central government. That's true. But there is no impediment now on local authorities to deal with the housing crisis because there's no restriction on what's called the housing revenue account that they used to mean that local authorities were restricted on how much they could borrow to invest. And of course, housing investment is very different because any money that a local authority borrows to build a council house or indeed to acquire a property on the open market, the cost of doing that is serviced by the income stream from the rents. So it's a political choice. They should be building far more council houses. And that would, of course, generate jobs for people, good quality jobs, skilled jobs for people. So you're providing that economic driver as well as dealing with a social problem, providing a lower cost alternative to the private rented sector. I mean, that's a racket, isn't it, the private rented sector? Very often people are forced into substandard privately rented accommodation. And wouldn't it be wonderful if the local authority was to use the powers at its disposal to build houses and to acquire houses on the open market? I used to be a bricklayer back in the 1970s, despite my soft hands, I used to really lay bricks. And, look, if there was a municipalisation programme, local authorities would, go and buy properties on the open market. Obviously, building takes some time to actually acquire the skilled skilled workers to do the necessary building and so on. But while you're training people up, you could actually be acquiring properties on the open market to deal with the housing crisis that Birmingham is experiencing. And I think Dave would be somebody who would make that case very, very cogently. And I think if we can alert people to the fact that it's a political choice, this housing crisis, that the council is choosing not to use the powers at their disposal to deal with it, I think people will actually turn away from those who they put their faith in on the local authority for, whether it be Tory or Labour, they've all let them down. And the same is true, for cuts, because there's alternative to the cuts in the public services that we've seen. They could be using the huge reserves that local authorities have at their disposal. They could be introducing a redistributive council tax where they only ask the wealthy to pay a bit more, and to freeze or even reduce the council tax for the rest. There are alternative choices available to people who run these local authorities. They just choose not to do it. And so I think our mission is to go out there and inspire people, to raise political consciousness, to raise political expectations as well. And I can't think of a better person to do that than Dave Nellist, because, as I say, somebody with a proven track record. When he was the MP for Coventry, I think he won the MP of the Year, didn't he, or some award. He was seen as the best backbench MP in the House of Commons. And how did the Labour Party reward Dave for that? They kicked him out back then. And we're back in those days today, aren't we? It's an absolute travesty, frankly, the way the Labour Party is operating. So we have a situation where we have a real opportunity now, it seems to me, to make a real difference here. To elect somebody who will be a genuine community champion, somebody who will absolutely shake up that status quo, that cosy status quo between the Tories and the Labour Party down in Westminster. Somebody who will certainly challenge the local authority. When Dave lost his seat back in 1992, he didn't sort of take his bat and ball home. He continued to work as a community champion, providing advice and support, and representing local people, and actually got elected onto the local authority back then as well. Dave is the real deal, and there are very few of them, if any, in Parliament at the moment. We've got a chance to make a real difference if we actually can get Dave elected here in Erdington. So I urge everybody to use every sinew in your body to support this campaign, to get out there on the knocker, to talk to your friends and your family, in the workplace, in the club, in the pub, to actually make the argument that we need a change. That term, time for a change, it's a hackneyed phrase, it's much overused, but God, if ever there was a time for a change, it's now, isn't it, comrades? Let's make that change happen. Let's make sure we elect Dave Nellist.
Thanks very much, Chris, for that excellent speech. I'm going to now hand you over to Siobhan, who's going to be speaking a few minutes just regarding the situation facing the council cuts in Birmingham.
Thank you, Chair. Very kind. I haven't said anything yet, but thank you. So my name is Siobhan. I am a member of the Socialist Party here in Birmingham. I've lived in Birmingham all of my life. And I have to say that going back not that many years, I was not interested in politics, be it elections or being active in politics, anything at all. And the reason for that was that my very first experience with voting for an MP was in the 2010 general election, when I voted for the Liberal Democrats, then led by Nick Clegg. If you don't remember it, he made one fairly major election promise, which was that he would vote against the raising of tuition fees. And then as soon as he got into a coalition with the Conservatives, he in fact voted in support of tripling tuition fees. Now that actually didn't affect me personally. I was at uni at the time, so it didn't come into effect while I was there. But it did tell me that there was literally no point in voting in elections because, well, if they can just say one thing and then deliver something completely different, and there be no consequences for that whatsoever, then what is the point? So I just thought, well, no. That I'm just not going to take any part in that. And then for the next 12 years, we've watched us Tory and then Lib Dem austerity rain down on ordinary people. And Birmingham has, every major city has been hit hard, but Birmingham has been hammered by cuts. And some of them are hard to explain how vicious they are. Like every council-run nursery in the city was closed down. All of them. We had the devastating cuts to Remploy, who used to help disabled people into work. I've worked in schools for a lot of that time, and the overwhelming majority of schools in Birmingham now say that they physically cannot run their special education needs departments because there is not enough funding and there are not enough teachers or any other form of support. The major cuts that have come to schools have been on pupil premium, which if you don't know is funding that goes into schools to support the lowest income bracket of children with their academic pursuits. And that has been really cut in major cities, and Birmingham was one of the hardest hit by that. But it wasn't just cut, it was redistributed. So much wealthier constituencies actually saw a rise in their pupil premium funding. So the decisions being made for cuts, particularly in Birmingham, were not random or just from central government. They were vicious, and they were aimed at the people who would definitely not fight back, who would have no voice with which to fight back. And the turning point for me came a couple of years after the 2010. It might have been just a year after. My mother is a care worker. She worked as a residential carer, which is for adults with learning disabilities. And mobility allowance across the board was gotten rid of, not just cut, just it's gone. And mobility allowance allowed the residents of her care home to go out to day centres and have tactile learning and a bit of socialisation. It was the one and only form of independence, a bit of normality to these adults with learning disabilities. Adults with such profound learning disabilities that could not live at home. And to hear the stories of how they just couldn't do it anymore, unless they could pay privately. So unless they were wealthy, they just weren't allowed anymore. They just lost this thing. And nobody could explain why. And it was absolutely heartbreaking. Good timing. But it was worse than that. It was enraging. And you would sit and just feel this fury bubbling and just think, how can anyone do this? How could anyone pick on this group of people that could not have less of a voice in this city? So I thought, oh no, I'm not going to do what they want me to do. I'm not just going to not be involved. Because not being involved keeps the status quo in place, and that status quo hasn't worked for us. And it's not working for vulnerable people, it's not working for ordinary people or working people. So I'm going to do something. So I looked around for somebody else who was doing something, and I found the Socialist Party. And I've been in the Socialist Party 10 years now, I think. But obviously not, because I can't possibly be that old. So it must be less than that. So I joined in order to fight against these really unfair attacks on ordinary people and to fight for a fairer system. And we've been doing that now for ever since. So I would urge anyone here today, if you are a local and Erdington, you can vote in this election, please vote for Dave. We will need an MP who will be a real voice for us in Parliament, because there's an obvious bad guy to these cuts. There's an obvious, the Tories have done this, and then for the first 5 years they were propped up for the Liberal Democrats. But also, in that time, this council has been run by Labour. 10 out of the 12 years, I believe, was entirely Labour controlled. So all of those cuts, those vicious, horrible cuts that have happened to this city, were put through by Labour, and not reluctantly, in many cases, gleefully. Such as the bin strike a few years ago, where they went at it with such... It was like they wanted it to happen. It's like, well, what has happened to Labour that they're excited to attack workers in this way? So none of the major parties, or any other party, are doing what we need them to do. They're not providing that voice. So if you can vote for Dave, I'd absolutely urge you to do so, to give us that ordinary person or worker's voice in Parliament. But also, if you are not currently involved with the Socialist Party, I would urge you to get involved. Come and speak to one of us today. You can get involved with this campaign. You can get involved with... you could join us if you want to. We'd love that, of course. But you can come and ask any questions you want to ask and know how you can become a campaigner in your city. Because when we will fight on this election, of course, when we fight for a voice in Parliament. When the election is over, we'll keep fighting. And we'll fight on picket lines, in workplaces, and in the streets for a fairer system for ordinary people. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Siobhan. Just before we finally move on to Dave, we'll just polite reminder, if you could put your phones on silent. Not because of the Benny Hill thing, it's just to move on.
Community activists.
Community activists, there you go.
In a round circle.
Yeah, exactly, yes. Skimpily dressed and all that. Yeah, lovely image to have in my head before we finish up. Anyway, finally, we'll just move on to our final speaker, Dave Nellist. And I'll just point out, anybody who hasn't heard of Dave or met Dave before, Dave was previously a Labour MP between 1983 and 1992. Chris has already pointed out the fact that he was also a Socialist Party councillor on Coventry City Council after that point as well. And during the entire time, Dave was famous and peed off a lot of people, particularly in the Labour Party, for the fact that he only took a worker's wage, which as far as we're concerned, is a critical part of making sure that when you are elected, that you don't end up being sucked into the machine and then you're going down to London, going in the strangers bar, your free sandwiches and your subsidised beer, living a different lifestyle to working class people. And let's face it, working class people who put you in that position. We don't expect you to go down there and have it on us and have a good time while we're all struggling. And obviously, Dave has not just said he's going to do that, he's actually done that, and we're really proud of that. So I won't say anymore. Dave doesn't want to use the microphone because he's going to have his hands free for his notes. So I'm going to start speaking now and hand you over to Dave Nellist. Thank you.
I've also got a big gob as well. Firstly, my apologies. I went to see Erdington Local in the shopping centre a couple of days ago. Spent an hour chatting. You'll probably see some of it on their website in a day or so's time. And one of the questions towards the end of the interview was, how are you going to answer people when they say, you're not from Birmingham and you don't live in Birmingham? And my answer was, don't worry, I'm only 30 minutes down the road. But we left at 11 o'clock this morning. And I knew of 3 of the 6 diversions we've been through. We've been to Berkswell, what a bloody place. They're spending £100 billion on HS2 to get people from London to Birmingham 15 minutes quicker. And it's taking 90 minutes now to get from Coventry across to Birmingham. So my apologies. My name's Dave Nellist. I'm the candidate for the Trade Unions and Socialist Coalition in the parliamentary by-election on March the 3rd. And what I want to do in the 20 minutes or thereabouts is to tell you a little bit about myself, though Ted's preempted a couple of points I wanted to make. But more importantly, as I'll explain, a little bit about why we're standing in this election. Now, I'm going to start off by being completely immodest. I think I'm the best qualified and most experienced candidate in this election by far. I started off in 1982 and spent 4 years on West Midlands County Council. So I dealt with Birmingham and Coventry on a regional basis. I then went and did 9 years in Parliament. And whilst I was a backbencher, I was one of the first MPs to bring in a private member's bill to establish a national minimum wage. I extended the law to allow thousands of families with severely disabled babies disability living allowance from birth, which didn't exist at the time. I extended the law to protect health and safety shop stewards on oil rigs, because employment legislation traditionally only applies on land, it doesn't apply in the offshore waters. And I led the parliamentary opposition that 18 million people refusing to pay the poll tax not only brought down the poll tax, but brought down Mrs. Thatcher in November 1990. I was expelled from the Labour Party for that because one of my best mates, Terry Fields, MP for Liverpool Broadgate, did 58 days in Walton Prison because we took the decision as socialists, members of the Socialist Party and or the militants as it was called then, and the leaders of the Anti-Poll Tax Federation, that when Mrs. Thatcher and Labour councils were putting pensioners in maximum security prisons like Dove for 3 months, we, at younger, more physically able, would stand in between the government and those who were being attacked in that way and say, take us first. Terry was the first one to go, and he did the days I say in Walton in prison, and I was next, and Roy Hattersley and Claire Short were the two people who moved my expulsion from the Labour Party for bringing the Labour Party into disrepute by standing shoulder to shoulder with 18 million people who couldn't pay that poll tax. So I was expelled. I then worked for 25 years as a welfare rights and debt specialist, 20 of them for the Citizens' Rights Bureau. And I represented hundreds of people in the local county court and at social security appeal tribunals, stopping evictions, stopping bankruptcies, getting people their benefits back, and so on. So that's why I think I'm the best qualified to stand in this election. But that's not the reason why I'm standing in this election. Chris was kind enough to mention about local campaigns. I want to put on record the fact we spent quite a long time, I could say, in the cold with Stephen and Estelle from Shortheath Plainfields last night. I now understand a lot better the position and the importance of the Plainfields in that area of the constituency. And as I explained to Stephen and Estelle last night, in the areas I have represented in Coventry, we have had exactly the same problems, where the council wanted to sell off an area of land, the playing fields that the local community used, and we mounted a huge campaign, 500 affidavits signed in community centres like this for people who'd used those fields for 50 years. Researched arcane law called village green applications, successfully prevented the green space being taken away, and now we've won national funding because of the 14th century Carthusian monastery that was a ruins on this area that nobody really knew existed. Now it's classed as one of the top 10 ecclesiastical monuments in the whole country. And it was the community that won that, but it did help that we had 3 of us on the council from the Socialist Party that could do the work in that campaign as well. So we will fight for those. We'll fight against the loss of jobs and the exporting of jobs, because Chris has mentioned that. I mean, the closure of GKN and the exporting of jobs, the loss of those skills, that doesn't need to happen. The Tories could have nationalised GKN and kept that factory alive in this constituency. Now, you don't often hear people say things like that. It must be impossible. Not at all. I started my life as an electrical and engineering apprentice for what was then British Aircraft Corporation, British Aerospace. And I did my first year's training in the Rolls-Royce Technical College in Bristol in Filton. And in February 1971, so that's what, 51 years ago, we were called into the lecture theatre in Rolls-Royce Technical College to be told that Edward Heath, the Tory Prime Minister, had nationalised Rolls-Royce to keep the engineering skills in one place. When it comes to defence, last October, the Tories nationalised Sheffield Forgemasters because of the contribution it can make to the metals that are used in things like small-scale nuclear power for nuclear submarines and so on. I would argue the contribution that GKN could have made to the future of electric vehicle manufacture in this country means that was a candidate that, if we had an halfway decent government, should have been nationalised, kept those skills together, and kept the community benefiting from a decent workplace with people on decent wages. So we will fight for those things as and when they come up. We won't be a manager like my main 2 opponents in this election, acting as different wings of the establishment, but a shop steward that acts on behalf of working people and their families, whether it's in workplaces or in communities. But that's not the main reason I'm standing either. And it's not that I'm doing it for the money. As has been mentioned, MPs are on £82,000 a year. I think they're overpaid. I think that when a new gas and electric bill drops on your mat in April, and it's £60 a month more than you're paying at the moment, it feels a lot different to working families in an area like Erdington than an MP on 3 times that wage of the average people in this area, and 2 or 3 times the holidays and the rest of the entitlement. MPs are insulated from day-to-day problems. They don't feel the same pressures as ordinary people do. So in the 1980s, me and my family, and Jane's here with me today, and she wasn't working for most of the time I was a member of Parliament, we took a wage that the engineering union across the 10 biggest factories in Coventry calculated was the tool-room rate, the skilled workers' rate. And it was well less than half an MP's wage, and the rest we donated to campaigns and to strike funds and things that benefited local people and their campaigns. And that's not really the reason why I'm standing in this election. No, this is the reason. The Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition, and I'm going to call it Tusk from now, they've asked me to stand because if either of my main 2 opponents in this election were elected, it wouldn't make a bit of difference to working people's lives in this area. If Robert Alden, the Tory candidate, is elected, he's a loyal Tory. Boris Johnson would still have an 80-seat majority if he's elected on March the 3rd. The Tory party would still treat working people with contempt. They made up the pandemic rules for us, which the majority of us abided by to protect our loved ones, whilst they're having parties down in 10 Downing Street. They ignored them. But if Paulette Hamilton was elected on March the 3rd, if Labour would, she'd be loyal Labour in the same way as Robert Alden would be a loyal Tory. And I think Siobhan's words are right. Labour shows a contempt for working people in this city and nationally. She tried to force, as cabinet member on Birmingham Council, on £41,000 a year as a cabinet member, low-paid, mainly women workers in the home care service, to take a cut in hours which could have led up to thousands of pounds cut in their wages. Now, to be honest, that contempt would fit in well with the direction that Keir Starmer is taking the Labour Party. The only difference would be she'd be on twice the salary at 82,000. She was on at 41,000 when she was sitting in the cabinet making that decision. None of the other candidates in this election will challenge the establishment view that in a decade-long period of economic crisis, and now in a post-pandemic period of economic crisis, working people and their families have to bear the brunt of it because the system must remain unchanged. Like that bit in the hymn about the Lord in his castle and the poor at the gate. You know, their estate is ordered and it will always remain the same. Well, we think we can send a voice that will challenge that, independent of the main party, shake up the establishment, not become part of it, and try and be an MP that the system can't buy. Now, a little bit more about me. I was born in North Yorkshire, top end of North Yorkshire, on the coast, at a place called Salton. My dad was a fitter for 43 years in the steelworks on the northeast coast. My mum cleaned the branch of the bank in our village, a former mining village, ironstone, not coal mining. And the greatest thing my mum and dad wanted for their son and daughters was for them to have a better and an easier life than they had coming out of the Second World War. We can't say that to our children. No? We can't promise them that tomorrow is going to be easier than yesterday. In the 1950s and 60s when I was growing up, one skilled wage for a couple of years would buy you a house. It would give you a couple of weeks holiday, in my case in the caravan that's where I got the idea from, actually, to buy my own when I retired, was it? In Skip. And that's because young people today face 8 to 10 times the wages that they can earn to be qualifying for a mortgage to buy a home. Then, like Siobhan said, education was free. Now there's about 12 to 1,500 young people in Erdington. At 18, go off to university. They come back 3 years later with a £50,000 debt. Again putting pressure on their inability to get a mortgage, to get a home. We want to see the abolition of fees and loans and a return to free education. But half the 18-year-olds don't go to university. And the chances in today's world, compared to what I grew up in, for a decent job and therefore getting things like a home are far less than they were then. In Birmingham, 12.5%, 1 in every 8 people are unemployed, and those who do enter into the job market enter into insecure employment, temporary contracts, 0-hour contracts, low pay. And Birmingham Council, under Labour control, has contributed to that by not fighting the Tory cuts of the last 12 years. Hundreds of millions of pounds have been lost in services, and we've lost a whole load of local community important services because of that, and thousands, tens of thousands of jobs have gone from the city. So we not only need an MP on March the 3rd with a new approach to challenge that, we also need new councillors as well to challenge that. And part of this campaign, and we'll be brutally honest with you, we're using this part of this campaign, we're using it to find the next generation of working class, community, particularly trade union involved as well, people who will stand in May in Birmingham, in Erdington and in Birmingham more widely, in order to challenge the council and their direction. Part of a national challenge where we hope to get approaching 1,000 new anti-austerity candidates standing around the country. Now, it's ironic, isn't it, that the first letter that Paulette Hamilton put out to her constituents says, I also know we need to clean the place up, collect the rubbish, sweep the streets and tackle the fly tippers. What it's actually saying is, vote for me, I'm part of the council that wanted to get rid of the bin workers. I'm part of the council that actually ended bulk waste-free collection. I'm part of the council that charges for that service. I helped create the mess on the street, so vote for me on double my wage so I can clear it up. So I say young people face an entirely different, this new generation, an entirely different world to the one I grew up in. And it's going to get worse. The last few months, and certainly the next few months, working people are going to be hit with price rises like we haven't actually seen, probably for 1 or 2 decades. Gas and electric prices are due to rise again by 54% in April and again in October. The official figure is about £680 if you're on a tariff, or about £720 if you're on a prepayment meter. The Joseph Rowntree Trust estimates that low-income families will face an average bill of £2,300 from April. Now, again, in this letter from Paulette Hamilton, she says, I'm backing Labour's plan for an immediate £200 cut in energy bills. That's in a bill that's going to go up the best part of £1,000. Labour's offering £200. The Tories are more generous. They're offering £350. But, and there's almost a but £200 of that is a loan. That over the next 5 years, the energy companies will charge you an even higher rate to claw back that money. So, whether it's Labour or it's Tory, of those bills, well over £500 they're going to put on your backs without any assistance. Now, why should we be paying for any rise in gas and electric? Any rise at all? The last 10 years, the big oil and gas companies have paid their shareholders £200 billion in dividends. Now, when you raise the idea that when Shell declares 14 billion last week and BP, I think it was 9 billion. By the way, both of those are predicting £40 billion in profit, just 2 companies, in the next 12 months. When you raise the idea of renationalisation, these are basic industries which are there for the public, they're utilities which are there for the public use. They should be publicly owned, democratically controlled. They say things like, oh, you can't do that because we have to invest. Dividends paid to shareholders are paid after you've done investment, not before. The price rises we're facing are going to add up to about 18 to 20 billion pounds over the next 6 to 9 months. 200 billion pounds in profit should be back in the public purse. It should be used for accelerated investment into clean, sustainable, renewable energy and used to cut the bills of working class people, not paid in shareholders' dividends to the rich and already wealthy within society. And Keir Starmer has explicitly said, whilst that used to be the policy of the Labour Party, it no longer is. Now, it's not just energy, it's food. For many families, then it will be a choice between food or fuel when those bills are coming in. And you're now seeing stories in the papers of people crowdfunding to try and raise the money to pay a bill. Or the increased use of food banks. We've got 17 food banks in Coventry. I have to confess, I don't know the exact number in Birmingham, but when I was with the Citizen Advice Bureau, I helped set up the remote advice session service in all the food banks in Coventry. So when people came to get the food bank, we'd have an advisor in the CAB that they could talk to over a tablet and the internet and get some advice and so on. But those food rises, the fuel that's already risen, the energy that's coming, the rise in broadband, the rise in national insurance, the council tax that will come in April. That's why workers are beginning to fight back. It's why, for example, in Coventry, the 77 HGV drivers, Unite members, Waster drivers employed by Coventry Council are absolutely right to be fighting for a decent pay rise, to try and protect what's already happened to those wages and to insulate them from the £1,000 to £2,000 that every family is going to find cut from their living standards in the next few months. Now, I've been a member of Unite and its predecessors for 48 years. Particularly proud of the direction my union is now taking. 111 disputes we've got on at the moment around the country, trying to hold the line and trying to fight back. And the politics of that, which we need, is an MP that would go down to Westminster and start a national campaign for a £15 an hour minimum wage in this country. So conscious of time, let me try and run through a bit faster. But then there's those who are not in. There's the retired, or those who are unable to work because of illness or disability, or unable to find work. The Tories have cut on universal credit by £20. I'm fairly sure the Tory candidate, if elected, would support Boris Johnson on that. Our pensioners get one of the worst rates of state retirement pension in almost any country in Europe. The maximum state retirement pension currently is £180 in Britain. In Ireland it's 212, in the Netherlands it's 254, and in Denmark it's £366 a week. In other words, twice the rate it is in Britain. If elected, we would fight for a 50% increase in pensions and benefits so that working people who are unable to work or have gone past working age are not walking down the high street trying to find the barbers that's got a deal for pensioners on a Wednesday morning, or shopping in the supermarkets at 9 o'clock at night, because that's when the reductions start to take place and you can get the food that's coming out of date that bit cheaper. But to have the dignity to walk down the street with your head held high, paying the same bills as everybody else because you've got enough money in your pocket and able to do that. And you can't say that for people on pensions and on benefits at the moment. Now, we raise things like that, but it's impossible. You cannot afford. How much is it going to cost? Well, I make a career in knowing these things. We spend £250 billion a year at the moment on pensions and benefits. So a 50% rise is £125 billion more. It does sound a lot of money. It is a lot of money. But we are the 5th richest country in the world. When the banks crashed because of their gambling and speculation in 2008, for the next few years, this country found £400 billion to bail out the banks. Mind you, the price came back on us with council cuts, with a decade freeze of wages. By the way, that decade was the worst decade for wages in this country since the Napoleonic Wars 200 years ago. But we are a very rich country. It is ironic that when Jeremy Corbyn stood in June 2017 and December 2019, he promised build more council houses, end tuition fees, improve wages and benefits, take a few essential industries back into public ownership. I think some of them were a bit milder than they should have been, but they're all things we would support and campaign for. And he got the best vote for Labour since Clem Attlee in December 17, 3.5, nearly 4 million extra votes. No other party's done that in the last 70 years. Then 2 years of sustained character assassination and the defeat that took place in December 20. And by the way, it wasn't the worst defeat since the 1930s. The number of votes Jeremy got on a national scale was more than Ed Miliband got in 2015, more than Gordon Brown got in 2010, and more than Tony Blair got in 2005. But what was the one thing that Theresa May said about Jeremy Corbyn's policies? We can't afford them. There's no magic money tree. So the crash comes, and we find not 82 billion of Jed's promises, but 400 to bail out the banks. Then the pandemic comes along 2 years ago, and we find another £400 billion, again mainly to protect businesses during the pandemic itself. And not only protect, by the way, but with some of the dodgy deals that were done, something like £4.5 billion went on PPE contracts without any checks and balances, which now the tax people and the Treasury are saying, we'll never get that back. Yeah. You're on universal credit. You go do a couple of hours cleaning down the bloody road, I'll tell you, they'll find investigators, find out, and get your 5 or 10 quid back off you. But when it's the Treasurer's mates, particularly the one down the road from him that ran the pub that got that big £1 million contract, they seem not to worry about it. Some £4 billion gone in fraudulent claims. Now, that's a lot of money, but I haven't actually mentioned the 2 biggest ones yet. The 2 biggest ones are these. First weekend in May, first Sunday in May, the Sunday Times brings out an annual rich list. It's been doing this for about 25 years. In 2008, when the banks went down, the richest 1,000 families in Britain were worth £250 billion. We then had a decade of austerity. Council services gone, wages frozen. The worst decade for 200 years. And we lost 600,000 jobs from council and so on. But by the way, because of that, communities were fractured. We didn't have the resources put in. And if you think about things like crime, particularly amongst youth, the fact that we have no glue called youth centres and youth workers and people that give young people a stake in a future in a town or city contributes to the fact that we have those problems further down the line. And the NHS. We were totally unprepared for this pandemic 2 years ago. We had 4,000 intensive care beds in January 2020. Germany had 27,000 intensive care beds. We had 100,000 jobs in the NHS, 42,000 of them nurses, unfilled, largely because a decade of wage freezes meant that health workers were 15 to 20% worse off, and they were leaving to try and get jobs so they could afford. And we've got the stories as well of nurses using food banks in order to make ends meet and so on. So we had that worst decade. At the end of that decade, 2008 to 2018, the rich list came out. The same 1,000 families, worth £250 billion at the beginning, £770 billion worth by the end of that. They tripled their wealth, whilst the rest of society was suffering in that way. And we should do something about that. The last figure, and it will be the last, I apologise, the snowstorm of statistics in this speech. I've only got a couple of pages to finish off. Is this. I spoke earlier about growing up in the 1960s. Now, I know the 60s and 70s weren't perfect. We started to struggle. I mean, 2 days ago, I was in the priory rooms in Birmingham Centre, the 50th anniversary on Thursday, the 10th of February, of one of the greatest moments in working class history in Britain, when 30,000 engineering workers from Birmingham, down tools, marched to Saltley Gate and stood on the picket lines of the miners and brought that strike to a successful conclusion. It was a proud day on Thursday to be with some of those conveners from Jaguar Land Rover and from other factories in Birmingham. But even with those battles, by the way, in 1975, we were one of the most equal countries on the planet. Every pound that was made, however, in the economy in a year in Britain, 2/3 of it went to working people in wages, and about 1/3 went to the rich. Fast forward 40 years with Margaret Thatcher and the succeeding prime ministers who followed her economics and neoliberalism that Chris mentioned, and today's £1 that is made, only 50% comes to working people, and 50% goes to the rich. That's because we're paying things like VAT on all the basics that we pay on that the rich don't pay. Or their tax rates, which used to be 80 and 90% in the 1970s, have now been dropped through the floor. They can push their money over into tax havens so you couldn't get taxed at all. Their corporate company taxes have been cut and so on. Now, the net result of that is £300 billion every year, which used to come to us in wages and services and now goes to that tiny sliver of the population at the top of the tree. So when they say we can't afford to restore council services, you can't afford a 50% increase in pensions and benefits, or £15 an hour, or restoring the libraries, the youth centres, the community centres, the NHS to what it used to be like. Restoring social care into public ownership of councils so they can be properly paid, properly trained, and our elderly people properly looked after. When they say we can't afford to do that, we say we're not a poor country, we're a very rich country. Just the wrong people have got the money. The wrong people have got the money. So that's why I'm standing. Because we need to change society so that the wealth which is produced by working people is owned and controlled by them. But you don't just get it by the petition online. You don't just get it by wishing for it. You have to build for it. And when we come to the bigger battles, the people who've got that money, the billionaires, and the politicians who work for them, the millionaires, who tell the rest of us, we're greedy by the way, they're not going to give it up lightly. We have to build a mass party that's rooted in the organisations and the communities of the working class that can change this country for the better. Because the establishment parties have got an overlapping agenda that protects the system, and the system rewards them with high wages, MPs on 82,000, all the rest of it higher up the tree to keep them loyal. Now, they will debate how working people should pay these price rises. We're going to get into this debate and say, why should working people be paying these prices? So, the last bit. Working people in Erdington, possibly more than anywhere else in the country, already feel that nobody speaks to them. All politicians are the same. Once they get down to London, they forget about the people who sent them down there. They're only in it for themselves. And because of that, barely half the people in Erdington vote for anybody at a general election. You may not know this, but there are 650 constituencies in Britain that send MPs. This constituency is 8th from the bottom of the people who vote in the election. Now that's not us blaming people. They can't see anybody from any established party that's going to make any difference to their lives. So yes, we want to shake up a few Tories in this election and put their record as a Tory government in front of them and say, why are you voting for Boris Johnson to continue in office? And yes, we want to shake up a few Labour voters our way in this election and say, why are you going to elect somebody who's currently on 41,000, who thinks that home care workers on 15 or 16,000 are overpaid, who wants a job on £82,000? What difference is she going to make? But more importantly than that, we want to say to the 47% of people in Erdington who don't vote for anybody in a general election, we've got a little bit of a chance in this election to make a bit of history, but only if you get involved, and not just on March the 3rd. We've got 7 wards in this constituency, elect 10 councillors. Let's see if we can't put a few socialists on the council from this constituency in May, and wider in Birmingham itself. But we do say particularly to those who were inspired by Jeremy Corbyn for the radical change he could make to the Labour Party, and are totally dismayed by Labour. And again, Chris is right, 150,000 people have left the Labour Party in the last 22 months because of the scandal. We do say to those people, don't drop out, get involved in a serious fight for a socialist alternative. The people of Erdington, lend us your vote on March the 3rd. Join us and get involved if you can. Join us and get involved in the long term if you can. The only promise we make is we won't let you down. Thanks for listening.